They always said silence was safer. I used to believe that too, until the moment I finally spoke. It was a Thursday, late afternoon. I had just returned from a vendor compliance meeting when my assistant slipped a note onto my desk. Marshall wants to see you. Conference room C, now. No context, no subject line, just the CEO summoning me like a school principal calling in a student. I wasn't nervous. I'd been with Dane Global for 22 years. I knew every system, every acquisition, every fire we'd put out since 2003. When the floor shook during the market crash, I was the one still standing in the war room, managing chaos while executives ducked for cover. I walked in and found Marshall alone, sleeves rolled up, hands resting on the table like he was preparing for a negotiation. He didn't offer a seat. "We're onboarding someone new," he began. "Name's Chloe. She'll be joining strategic integration. I'd like you to train her." There was a pause, just long enough to be deliberate. I blinked once. "Integration? That's a senior track unit." He nodded. "She has potential. She's sharp, very intuitive, and I think she'll bring a fresh perspective." That's when I realized he wasn't asking. I had met Chloe once, at the company gala. She was wearing a backless green dress and calling our head of logistics the warehouse guy. No business background, no technical experience, but a very firm grip on Marshall's arm. I stayed composed. "With respect," I said, "I don't believe I'm the right person to train her, and frankly, I'm not sure she's qualified for the role." The silence that followed was long, heavy. Marshall's smile faded. He tapped his pen once, then nodded, slow and cold. "That'll be all. Tina." No argument, no warning, nothing else. I left the room with my pulse steady, but something in my gut already knew. That night, I logged into the system to approve budget updates. Password denied. Tried again. Denied. I called a T. No response. I emailed HR. Auto reply. By morning, my badge would stop working. By evening, I'd no longer exist in the company I helped build, all because I said what no one else dared to say out loud. She wasn't qualified. And, apparently, neither was I. For silence. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waiting for a follow-up email, some sort of clarification. Maybe it was a mistake, some temporary lockout. Maybe IT had flagged something by accident. But when I arrived at the office the next morning, the security guard didn't even look at me. He just said, "You'll need to go straight to HR." No badge swipe, no access, no eye contact. My heels echoed louder than usual as I walked down the hallway. The same hallway where I'd once celebrated closing a $200 million logistics merger. The same hallway where I'd trained 6 department heads, rebuilt a broken vendor system from scratch, and spent more weekends than I cared to count. They didn't give me a seat when I got to HR. Just a thin folder and a forced smile. "Per executive directive, we're initiating a mutual separation. This is the standard agreement. You'll find the terms reasonable. Mutual separation." That's what they called it. Like I'd suddenly decided to take up gardening after 2 decades in boardrooms. I sat there in silence as she walked me through the generous severance package, the non-disparagement clause, the vague language around transition duties. But what made my stomach turn wasn't the numbers. It was a single sentence in the final section of the agreement. "Employee agrees to provide transitional guidance and knowledge handoff to Chloe Martin, incoming Director of Strategic Integration." Her name, in black and white, in legal print, on a contract about me. I held the folder in my lap and nodded. Barely. I wasn't going to give them the performance of outrage, but inside, my blood boiled. I had built the systems Chloe would now oversee. I had designed the integration protocol she'd be handed like a starter pack. I had fought for this company when no one else did, when Marshall was still proving he could tie a Windsor knot. And now they were asking me to pass it all down like family china, to someone who didn't know the difference between fiscal and physical inventory. I didn't sign. I walked out of HR and back toward my office, if you could still call it that. The nameplate was already gone. A janitor was stacking boxes next to my door. "They told me to start early," he said, not meeting my eyes. I thanked him, even though my voice cracked. As I sat at my desk one last time, I looked out the window and saw Marshall in the courtyard below, laughing with Chloe. She was wearing the same white blazer she wore to the gala, the same one she wore when she said our supply chain strategy looked kinda boring. My jaw tightened. I wasn't just dismissed, I was discarded, replaced, forgotten. They wanted my silence in exchange for a check and a signature. But what they didn't realize was, I wasn't planning to disappear, not this time. I always thought I'd leave on a Friday. Maybe there'd be a cake in the break room, a few awkward but kind speeches. Maybe Marshall would say something formal but decent. Maybe my team, my real team, would put together a card, pass it around. And someone would cry too soon. But instead, I stood alone in the corner of my glass-walled office on a Wednesday morning, watching a janitor stack my boxes. It was still early, just past 8. The floor hadn't fully filled yet. That was by design. HR had suggested I clear my space before peak hours. Clear my space. Not say goodbye. Not wrap things up. Just clear it. I'd spent over 2 decades in that corner office. I'd fought to earn it back when the company was still holding meetings in rented co-working spaces. I'd walked in on Monday mornings before the lights came on, and walked out most Fridays after the cleaning crew did. And now, I was supposed to pack it all away before anyone noticed I was gone. No farewell email, no handshake, no closure, just cardboard, silence, and a gnawing sense of erasure. I moved slowly, methodically, frame by frame. I took down pieces of my legacy, the supplier award from 2012, the framed thank you letter from a logistics partner who nearly went under before we helped turn things around, the photo of my team in front of our first international hub, half of whom had already left over the past 2 years. I'd been one of the last originals. Now, I'd be the next to vanish. No one knocked, no one stopped in, but I could feel them watching, through the glass. I saw faces I'd mentored, promoted, defended in budget meetings. Some gave tight, guilty nods as they passed. Others just looked away. One woman, Janelle, an analyst I'd once taken under my wing, walked past without slowing. Her arms were filled with printouts and binders. She had always been warm with me before, but now she moved as if I'd never been there. I didn't blame her, not really. Survival at Dane Global meant staying invisible when the winds shifted. And right now, I was radioactive. I reached for the last drawer, the one I always kept locked. Inside was a simple notebook, old, frayed at the edges, filled with personal notes, process diagrams, and handwritten thank you quotes from my first few years. I had forgotten it was there. I stared at the cover for a long time before slipping it into my bag. Just as I stood to close the box, I noticed something out of place on my desk, a yellow sticky note. I hadn't seen it before. It was stuck between the monitor and the base of my keyboard. It read, "You were the reason I didn't quit. Thank you. M." My chest tightened. M? Could have been Maddie, the new intern who joined 3 months ago. She barely spoke in meetings, but always stayed behind to ask smart follow-up questions. No name, no fanfare, just a scribbled message left behind by someone brave enough to say what no one else would. I pressed the note between my fingers, like it was the last proof I'd ever mattered. Then came the final blow. As I logged into the system to forward a few last files to my personal drive, I hit a block. Access denied. My account had already been disabled. Curious. I searched the internal directory from my phone, just to see if I was still listed. I wasn't. My name, my role, even my archived memos, Gone. It was as if I had never worked here. I sat down one last time in the office I had built with my own effort, my sleepless nights, my unwavering belief that doing good work was enough to protect you. I had been wrong. As I wheeled the last box toward the elevator, I didn't look back. I couldn't, because if I did, I might have started crying in a place that didn't deserve my tears. Not all comebacks begin with thunder. Some start with silence. 6 months before Marshall Dane decided I was no longer useful, I had already begun the slow work of building a life outside of him, though I didn't realize it at the time. It began with a lunch invitation from someone I hadn't seen in over a decade. His name was Joel Mercer, a former consultant turned venture technologist. We met years ago on opposite sides of a failing merger, but our mutual obsession with operational efficiency had kept us in touch, even if loosely. He called one afternoon out of the blue. "You still working miracles for ungrateful executives?" he asked over the phone. I laughed. "You say that like I have another option." "You do," he said. "Come hear me out. Lunch, my treat." That was how I ended up sitting across from him at a quiet cafe off Lexington Avenue at 12:15 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday. Joel had always been sharp, but that day, he looked charged, focused. He slid his laptop across the table and opened a prototype dashboard. "This," he said, tapping the screen, "is Nariva." The idea was bold, a strategic decision engine powered by adaptive AI. It could simulate the judgment of an entire executive strategy team using predictive algorithms, market trend analysis, and internal system data. No bias, no politics, no waiting for quarterly reviews. I was intrigued. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "A partner," he said. "Someone who knows the battlefield from the inside. Someone who's been buried under bad org charts and still managed to make sense of them." I didn't say yes immediately. I couldn't. I still had a full-time role and a department to lead at Dane Global. But something in me, something quiet but steady, leaned forward. Over the next several months, I helped him refine Nariva's logic engine in the evenings, after work, on weekends, in hotel rooms during conferences where I was still pretending to believe in the company I had served for years. We met discreetly, often at co-working spaces or borrowed offices under shell names. I used my middle name on internal documents. I never appeared in press releases. I didn't want credit. I wanted cover. And for the first time in years, I felt awake. We built, tested, broke, and rebuilt. We mapped out how to simulate multi-scenario strategy pivots without needing endless layers of committee meetings. Joel handled the tech. I translated the corporate chaos into architecture the system could understand. We were making something leaner, smarter, better. And then came our first test case. A logistics consultancy agreed to pilot the system in a regional branch that had been bleeding money for 3 quarters straight. Joel was excited. I was anxious. 2 weeks into implementation, the system helped them identify a pattern of underutilized vendor contracts, saving over $300,000 in the first month alone. They were we were validated. What Joel didn't know, and what I only realized later, was that this consultancy was a former partner of Dane Global. In fact, they had worked with us on a supply chain restructuring 3 years earlier. I had been on the original project. When I saw the name on the post-analysis report, I froze. It felt like a ghost had wandered into the new house I was building. But I said nothing. I let it happen. Quietly. Intentionally. Like letting a branch bend under pressure just enough to snap back later. Harder. After that success, more clients signed on. Quiet ones. Ones that didn't need flash. They needed results. I stayed off the radar. Behind the curtains. Always 2 steps from the spotlight. I wasn't chasing revenge. I wasn't chasing glory. I was building something that couldn't be taken away with a revoked badge, a security lockout, or a smug smile in a boardroom, for the first time in my career. I wasn't waiting for permission to lead. I was writing my own blueprint. I didn't need applause. I didn't even need them to know I existed. But someday soon, they'd walk into the very room I had built. They would shake hands with the face of Nareva. They would sign a deal under the name they didn't recognize. And only when it was far too late, only when everything was inked and sealed, would they realize I never really left. I told myself I wouldn't look back, that once I left Dane Global, I'd bury the name, burn the logo in my mind, and walk forward. But some disasters are too loud to ignore. 3 weeks after I cleared out my office, the rumblings began. A missed delivery contract here, a delayed audit there, quiet issues that wouldn't make headlines. But inside the industry, people noticed, especially those who used to work with me. Chloe had been handed the keys to a system she didn't understand, and she was driving it straight into the ocean. From the outside, Dane Global still projected confidence, new branding, social media posts with words like agility, modern leadership, and vision. Chloe was in every photo now, smiling, shaking hands, dressed like a startup founder in heels. But beneath the filters, the cracks widened. I wasn't stalking them, but I still had friends on the inside. People who'd send the occasional late-night text or call after a few drinks. Not gossip, not drama, just quiet intel. One message came from Javier, a veteran in vendor relations. "You were right. She's drowning." Another from Sherry, one of the few people who had dared to hug me on my last day. "We lost 2 contracts this week. Clients are asking where you are." I read every message twice, then 3 times. I didn't respond. Instead, I logged into Nareva's private dashboard, the one only Joel and I had access to. There, I could track market chatter, contract instability patterns, client transition risk. Dane Global's numbers lit up like a bad EKG. In 6 weeks, they'd lost 3 mid-tier clients and were hemorrhaging staff at the mid-manager level. People weren't complaining. They were walking away. Chloe had tried to implement a top-down integration plan that looked sleek in a PowerPoint deck, but collapsed on contact with reality. She hadn't consulted the ops team. She'd fired the data analyst who tried to push back. She'd authorized a system overhaul that disconnected the warehouse from the ordering portal for 48 hours. 48 hours. In logistics. That's a year of apologies. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt tired. There was no pleasure in watching the machine I once helped run begin to grind against itself. No satisfaction in hearing ex-colleagues whisper that the woman who replaced me was in over her head. I didn't want her to fail, but I didn't want her to succeed either. I remembered the look on Marshall's face when he dismissed me with a pen tap and a smirk. I remembered Chloe's blank smile. The way she called our analyst team the spreadsheet squad. They had made their choice, and I had made mine. One evening, as I was reviewing Nareva's next launch schedule, my phone buzzed. Unknown number, New York area code. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text followed. "Ms. Waverly, I'm a regional partner at Northridge Logistics. We worked with Dane during your tenure. We're looking for someone to evaluate a contract restructure. Are you still consulting independently?" I stared at the message for a long time. Northridge. I remembered them. Small but growing. They had been loyal, transparent, and underappreciated. We'd saved them from collapse once. Apparently, they hadn't forgotten. I could hear Joel's voice in my head. They always come back, to the person who actually fixed the mess. I didn't answer right away. Part of me hesitated. Would saying yes mean I was re-entering the same battlefield I had just escaped? Was this about helping or proving a point? But another part of me, the one that had spent 2 decades cleaning up chaos, straightened its shoulders. I typed back, I'm listening. Send me the details. I hit send. No emoji, no signature, just clarity. If Chloe was in over her head, it wasn't my responsibility to save her, but it was my responsibility to use what I knew, to serve the people who still remembered what real leadership looked like. The collapse wasn't loud. It came in small ripples, missed client check-ins, supply errors, talent exits that began as whispers and ended in mass resignations. I didn't need to dig. The data spoke on its own. Noriva's internal trend monitor flagged Dane Global's operational stability index 4 weeks in a row. Still, Marshall didn't flinch. Instead, he doubled down. At 9:15 a.m. one Monday, I got a message forwarded from a contact still within the industry's HR network. Chloe Martin has been promoted to Executive Vice President of Strategy. No announcement, no performance results, just elevation. It was the kind of decision that made people quietly question leadership but publicly nod. That was Marshall's trademark, choosing loyalty over logic, proximity over performance. The irony? I wasn't even angry anymore. I sat in my quiet, sunlit workspace, Nariva's design lab outside Brooklyn, and watched the company that once buried me chase its own tail in circles. I didn't cheer, I didn't fume, I just observed. Because now, I didn't need to raise my voice. The numbers spoke louder than I ever could. Every week, Nariva onboarded another mid-sized firm. Some came out of curiosity, some out of desperation, but all stayed for results. Joel called me into a strategic huddle at 10:30 a.m. one Wednesday. "We're closing the ring," he said, spreading the dashboard across our conference screen. "At this rate, we'll have coverage across 3 regions in Q3. I nodded. "We'll need a stronger operations lead, someone who knows how to handle growth quietly." He leaned back. "I might have the perfect person." That's when Rachel walked into the room. I hadn't seen her in nearly 5 years. She used to be one of our most capable mid-level strategists at Dane Global. Analytical, composed, and criminally underutilized. I remembered the day she was transferred to a non-core project, just to make room for someone with a fancier title. "Hello again," she said, offering a smile that held both warmth and memory. "You're with Nariva now?" I asked, even though I already knew. "Started 2 months ago." She nodded. "Didn't realize you were behind it until the dots connected." Her voice was steady, but her eyes held something deeper. Recognition. Maybe even relief. Later that afternoon, she sent me a message through our internal network. "Haven't said this out loud, but it's clear now. You've always been the one actually leading the game." I stared at the message for a long time. There was no need to reply. She knew. The same systems I once built in the background of another man's empire. I was now redesigning openly, though still quietly. I didn't need applause or a corner office anymore. I had reach. I had impact. I had the right people finding their way back. Not because I asked them to, but because they chose to return. That's the kind of control no title can buy. Meanwhile, Chloe continued her chaotic campaign. A botched data rollout, a client retreat in San Diego that turned into a PR headache, and another quarter with zero growth in strategic partnerships. Still, Marshall kept her close, either from ego or blindness. And me? I didn't say a word. I watched Chloe post conference selfies on LinkedIn with vague captions like "growth through grit." I watched Marshall repost them with hashtags like "innovation in action." Behind their backs, the clients were migrating, the consultants were leaving, and one by one, the advisors who mattered stopped calling them and started calling us. By 4 p.m. that Friday, we'd secured a new contract, one that Dane Global had been chasing for 6 months. They hadn't even realized we were in the running. As Joel and I signed the final approval, he looked up and asked, "What's the play here? Long term? Take them down?" I shook my head slowly. They're taking themselves down, I said. I'm just making sure I'm in position when the dust settles. And I meant it. There's power in presence. There's power in silence. And there's unmatched power in knowing you no longer have to fight to win. By the time Dane Global finally reached out, I was no longer angry, not even curious. I had moved so far beyond the noise of boardroom betrayals and hollow promotions that it almost felt surreal when Joel dropped the news during our weekly sync at 10 o'clock a.m. on a Tuesday. "You're going to love this," he said, spinning his laptop around. "Dane Global just submitted a partnership inquiry form." I raised an eyebrow. "You're kidding." "Nope. Formal request. Signed by their board liaison. They want to schedule a discovery session. Urgent. High priority." He paused, then added with a grin. "Guess who recommended us?" I didn't even have to say it. "Chloe," he said. "Apparently she met someone at a tech summit who's a client of ours. Got excited about the metrics. Pitched Nariva internally last week." I leaned back in my chair, processing it all. Chloe didn't know. She couldn't have. My name wasn't on the site. I had scrubbed every trace of affiliation. Nariva's client-facing presence belonged to Joel, our head of communications, and a team of well-curated spokespeople. I'd designed it that way. Not out of fear, out of precision. This was the moment I'd architected without ever forcing it. They were reaching out not because I demanded respect, but because the numbers gave them no other choice. "Do you want to take the meeting?" Joel asked. "Yes," I said after a beat. "But not as a founder, not as anything visible." He nodded. "You'll be the strategist in the background, silent advisor." Exactly. There was no need to grandstand. This wasn't about revenge. It was about relevance. They had ignored my voice when I gave it freely. Now, they were chasing an echo of that voice without even knowing its source. We scheduled the first meeting for 2:30 p.m. on a Thursday. Virtual. Joel would lead. I would join quietly. Camera off. Name set to Advisor TW. I didn't even feel the need to watch the whole call. But I did. They entered the meeting late. Marshall looked tired. Thinner. Chloe wore a blazer 2 sizes too large and smiled too quickly between sentences. Their CTO stumbled through a technical summary, peppered with buzzwords that fell flat. Joel was calm, direct, sharp as ever. "We built Nariva to solve the decision drag that kills strategy in most mid-market enterprises," he said. "What we offer isn't just software. It's cognitive reinforcement for leadership under pressure." The Dane Global team nodded eagerly. Chloe spoke up next. "I think this is exactly what we need. The platform's predictive capacity could fill several gaps we're struggling to close internally." Joel smiled. "Glad to hear that. You were the one who recommended us, correct?" She nodded proudly. "Yes! I met one of your current clients, Canwell Group, at the Momentum Summit in Boston. They raved about you." My lips curled into the smallest, stillest smile. Canwell Group was one of the first accounts I closed after going independent. I had personally implemented the integration protocol that blew their previous analytics process out of the water. Of course they raved. The meeting ended with mutual interest, a signed NDA, and a request to prepare a tailored pilot. When the screen went dark, Joel looked over at me. "Well," he said, "that was poetic." "I didn't write poetry," I replied. "I just drew the blueprint. They walked into it on their own." That night, I poured a glass of wine, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge the moment. The win wasn't in being chosen. The win was in being necessary, indispensable. They had overlooked me, underestimated me, erased me, and still, when they needed a solution they could trust, they walked straight into the house I built. I didn't need an apology. I didn't even need them to know. Because real victory isn't loud. It's quiet, calculated, earned, and best served while they still think you're a stranger. Strategy isn't about loud wins. It's about quiet control. By the time Dane Global submitted their request for proposal, we were already 5 steps ahead. Joel and the legal team prepared the basics, but the finer details, the delicate threads that would bind them to Nareva, those were mine to weave. I spent the better part of 3 days drafting the structure for a strategic pilot agreement. Not a full deployment, just enough to be non-threatening, just enough to slip inside the cracks of their failing system and become irreplaceable. I designed it like an anchor dressed as a feather. At 9 a.m. on Monday, I pulled up the final draft. 3-month integration for cross-functional strategic modeling. Weekly syncs requiring participation from key stakeholders. Shared access to internal metrics for AI tuning renewal clauses tied to performance. Auto-triggered if thresholds were met. Most importantly, joint IP licensing on workflow enhancements. The last clause was subtle. Legal would see it as collaborative, but operationally, it meant any improvements we made together would remain partially owned by Nareva, even if they walked away. In short, the more they leaned on us, the harder it would be to leave. Joel looked over the document at 1:30 p.m. and gave me a single nod. Cold, he said, but brilliant. We submitted the proposal by 10 a.m. Tuesday. Dane Global replied within 4 hours, eager, optimistic, embarrassingly grateful. The response included a slide deck. Chloe's name was on the cover. I opened it casually at first. Standard welcome pitch, pain points, project alignment, implementation goals. But page 7 stopped me cold. There it was. A full breakdown of a model I had written myself, nearly 4 years ago. The format had changed slightly, titles renamed, fonts updated. But the structure, the logic trees, even the flow of dependencies, it was mine. She hadn't even bothered to rewrite the summary paragraph. It still included my original phrasing, cross-tier alignment through narrative friction mapping, a phrase no one else on the team ever used. I stared at the screen for a full minute, completely still. Then I smiled. Not out of rage, not even from surprise, but from a place of absolute strategic clarity. She had copied me, presented my work as hers, and now, 4 years later, she was using that same stolen logic to bring us to the table. Joel noticed my expression. Something wrong? He asked. No, I said, closing the slide deck. Everything's exactly where it should be. I didn't confront her. That wasn't the game. Instead, I added one more clause to the pilot agreement, a language audit clause that required all strategic documentation submitted to Nareva to be cross-referenced for originality and flagged through internal content analysis. Nothing dramatic. Just policy. If Chloe continued submitting recycled ideas, the system would quietly document the source, ours. The next meeting was scheduled for 3:15 p.m. Thursday. Marshall opened with polite nods. Chloe did most of the talking, animated, enthusiastic, almost oblivious to the weight of the deal being wrapped around them. Joel presented Nareva's onboarding roadmap. I stayed silent. My name still masked as Advisor TW. At one point, Chloe said, "We're especially excited about the second phase modeling. It aligns well with the strategy framework I developed during my first year here." I glanced at the corner of the screen where her initials sat beside the document she had submitted. I almost felt sorry for her. She didn't realize I had been in the room the first time that document was written. She didn't realize I had authored the roadmap she now called hers. She didn't realize that every word she spoke tightened the dependency her company had on mine. When the call ended, Joel leaned back and said, "I think they're ready to sign." "They already did," I replied. "They just don't know it yet." That night, I sat on my balcony at 8:30 p.m., watching the city lights blur in the distance. The wind was sharp, clean. I didn't toast, I didn't gloat, I just breathed deeply. Knowing that strategy isn't about taking power back, it's about making them hand it to you, willingly, eagerly, thinking it was their idea all along. The meeting was set for 3 p.m. at the Leighton Grand, a hotel known for its high ceilings, velvet chairs, and silence thick enough to sharpen a knife. I arrived late, on purpose. Joel and I had discussed it earlier that morning. "You show up last," he said. "Minimal movement. Let them settle. Let them feel in control." I didn't need theatrics. I needed pressure. Quiet pressure. The kind that builds without sound. The room was a private suite on the mezzanine level, overlooking a marble courtyard. A long glass conference table stretched beneath an arched ceiling. Soft jazz played in the distance. Bottled water, monogrammed notepads, controlled perfection. Marshall sat at the far end, flanked by Chloe on his right and Dane Global's CFO on his left. Joel and our legal counsel had already taken their seats across from them. They didn't look up when I entered. My heels tapped softly against the floor as I moved toward the empty seat beside Joel. No introduction, no need. I placed a slim leather folder in front of me, clicked my pen once, and exhaled. That's when Chloe glanced up. For a moment, nothing changed. Her eyes flicked to me, then away, then back again. She froze mid-turn, her lips parting slightly, her face paled. But she said nothing. Marshall didn't notice. He was too busy summarizing what he called the exciting new chapter of collaboration. His tone was polished, confident, but his eyes, shifting, darting, betrayed him. As Joel began reviewing the agreement points, I remained still. Not a word, not a smile, just presence. I could feel the air change, not suddenly, but gradually, like a room losing oxygen one breath at a time. Chloe began presenting next. Her voice trembled at first, barely enough to register. But I heard it. She gestured toward the screen, where a branded slide deck appeared. Strategic alignment, Phase 1. She was repeating language I'd written years ago. I recognized every word. Behind her, a young man stood adjusting cables, an assistant or tech coordinator. Early 20s, sharp suit. I didn't recognize him at first, but he kept glancing over at me. At 3:27 p.m., I caught his eyes for just a moment. He tilted his head slightly, then leaned toward Chloe and whispered something. She stiffened. Marshall finally turned his head toward me and paused. It didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, like a tide pulling back before a wave crashes. First, the confusion in his brows, then the flicker of memory, and finally, the drop. Recognition, brittle and breathless. "Tina?" he said, barely audible. Joel kept talking, unbothered, but Marshall's eyes stayed locked on me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The realization hung in the air like humidity. Uncomfortable, invisible, impossible to ignore. His mouth opened again, but no words came. I clicked my pen once more and began flipping through the agreement packet in front of me. My signature box was empty. The contract was ready. Across the table, Chloe's fingers gripped her notepad. She stopped taking notes. The confident smile she had worn walking in was now gone, replaced by something unsure, something afraid. Joel closed his remarks and slid the agreement forward. "We're prepared to finalize today if everyone is aligned." Everyone turned to Marshall. He cleared his throat, twice, then nodded. "We're aligned." I lowered my pen. Signed. A single loop of ink across a contract that shifted control without a single argument, without a raised voice, without even saying my name. Afterward, as they stood to shake hands, Marshall hesitated before extending his. "You're with Nareva?" he asked. I finally met his eyes. "Just a strategist," I said. "Helping where I'm needed." He nodded once, his face a battlefield of confusion and reluctant respect. I walked out ahead of the group, didn't look back. Outside, the hotel lobby buzzed with the low hum of travelers, business people, and polished ambition. But for me, the silence in my steps was enough. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't slammed a door. But I had returned to the table. And this time, I had the pen. He stood still, his hand suspended halfway across the table, like it wasn't sure whether to retreat or reach farther. "Tina," he said again, this time more certain, more shaken. I met his gaze, calm and unblinking. Behind us, the air conditioner hummed. No one moved. Not Joel, not Chloe, not even the assistant in the corner pretending to organize folders that didn't need organizing. "You're with Nareva?" Marshall asked, the question barely above a whisper. I gave him the truth, simple and sharp. "I am." He didn't respond. His face twitched as if sorting through 1,000 calculations. Cost, memory, regret, and ego, all colliding in real time. He blinked twice, his throat tightening against unspoken disbelief. No one had warned him. Of course they hadn't. I had designed it that way. Let them think I vanished. Let them assume I'd taken the check and the humiliation and disappeared into some obscure consulting gig. Let them live in the illusion that they had buried me quietly. Because now, as he stood there trying to compute how the woman he fired was sitting across from him holding the keys to his company's last hope. The imbalance was perfect. Chloe's voice broke the silence first. Shaky, defensive. We didn't realize you were affiliated with Nareva." I turned to her slowly. She looked smaller now, her posture less rehearsed, her voice less confident. The girl in the sharp suit had become a silhouette of her LinkedIn profile photo. "I know," I said flatly. Then silence again. Joel cleared his throat and stood to finalize the documents. He pushed the folder gently toward Marshall, who hadn't moved. His eyes were still on me, like I was a specter from a past he thought he'd erased, but I was very much alive, and very much the one holding the pen now. I didn't gloat, I didn't smile, I just waited. "Do you have any objections to the agreement?" Joel asked. Marshall inhaled. "No," he said, finally taking his seat, almost mechanically. "No objections." Chloe started to say something else, but stopped. The room had shifted. The power wasn't on her side anymore. She felt it too. That's when it happened. A voice from the far end of the table, measured, mature, and unfamiliar. "I'm sorry," said one of the board members, an older man in a navy blazer who'd been silent the entire meeting. "Forgive my ignorance, but why exactly is Ms. Waverly no longer with our firm?" Marshall didn't answer. Neither did Chloe. The silence stretched thin and sharp. I looked across the table and locked eyes with the man who had just asked the question. "I was let go," I said, voice cool. "After refusing to train someone, less qualified for the role I had built." He nodded once. "I see." He didn't need elaboration. He understood the implication. So did the rest of the room. It wasn't just a comment, it was a crack, a shift in perception, a seed of doubt planted in front of the very people Marshall needed to maintain control. Because once doubt enters a boardroom, it spreads like mold. I stood, deliberately slow, and reached for my copy of the signed agreement. My name, full and visible, was now on the last page. Tina Waverly, strategist, silent partner, power reclaimed. No one tried to stop me as I turned to leave. The room behind me stayed still. Even Joel remained seated, letting the silence work its magic. Outside, the hallway felt warmer than the conference suite. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. At the elevator, I heard the soft ding and stepped in. Alone, as the doors closed. I looked at my reflection in the polished chrome. This time, I wasn't the woman being walked out of a job. I was the woman walking out of a deal, one she had just orchestrated from the inside. And the ghost they thought they saw? She was very real. Victory didn't feel like fireworks. It didn't sound like applause or flash with sudden glory. It was quiet, heavy, almost still. The kind of silence that settles in just after a storm, when everything broken is revealed. The agreement lay open on the table, crisp pages fanned neatly across polished glass. My name, Tina Waverly, was printed beneath the final signature line. Bold and unmistakable. No titles, no disclaimers, just the truth, across from me. Marshall sat motionless. His hands were folded tightly, knuckles pale. Chloe kept her gaze low, staring at her legal pad as if a missing answer might suddenly appear there. The board member who had asked about my exit didn't look at me, but he didn't look at Marshall either. He simply leaned back in his chair, silent, as the shape of the room shifted around him. Joel nodded once. "We're ready whenever you are." "Tina." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I reached for the pen, simple, silver. The same kind they had once used in our quarterly budget reviews. The room held its breath as I leaned in and signed. Not quickly, not ceremoniously, but steadily. My name flowed across the page in a single stroke. Final, absolute, no flourish, just fact. When I looked up, no one moved. I slid the folder forward, sealing the deal that had taken months to orchestrate, and almost 2 decades to deserve. This wasn't just a vendor contract. This was Nariva assuming strategic authority, and they hadn't even realized the weight of what they'd signed. The brilliance of it was in the fine print, Clause 12 on 6, buried under harmless language about performance assessments and shared metrics. But the clause transferred administrative oversight of all client performance review portals to Nariva for optimization support, which meant every quarterly review, every pipeline analysis, every vendor benchmark that Dane Global conducted with its strategic partners would now run through a Nariva integrated system built on my architecture. It wasn't just a contract, it was control. Joel gave me a slight nod, our silent confirmation. He'd pushed for that clause. I designed its language, and their legal team, eager to close, had waved it through. Chloe cleared her throat. "We'll review implementation protocol internally and assign a liaison to your systems team." She said it quietly, like she was reading off a script she no longer believed in. "Of course," Joel replied smoothly. "We'll keep Tina looped in during the transition phase." Chloe flinched, just barely. Marshall didn't say anything, not even a nod. I stood, no parting remarks, no rehearsed speech. I didn't offer my hand. I simply gathered my materials, slid the pen into my folder, and took one final look around the table. The same boardroom energy I had once known so well now felt foreign, flattened, quieted. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even satisfied in the way most people define it. I was something else entirely. Settled. Outside the suite, the corridor was lined with abstract artwork and hushed footsteps. I walked past the receptionist, who gave me a polite smile. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime at 4:25 p.m. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors began to close, I heard faint voices behind me. Joel's, calm and steady. Chloe's, clipped. Marshall's silence echoing more loudly than any word he might have spoken. Let them process. Let them replay every moment. I had been erased quietly. Now I had returned the favor, without raising my voice, without taking the spotlight, only action, only signature, only results. When I reached the lobby, sunlight spilled through the tall windows. Outside, the world kept turning. Buses pulled away from the curb. Briefcases tapped against polished shoes. Meetings were ending and beginning in glass buildings up and down the avenue. I stood for a moment. Still. I wasn't just on the other side of the story. I was the one holding the pen when it closed. And they knew it. I didn't wait for the elevator doors to close before I turned off my phone. I didn't want a congratulations text. I didn't want Joel's debrief. I didn't want Chloe's predictable follow-up email pretending none of it had just happened. I just wanted a moment of silence that belonged entirely to me. When I stepped out into the lobby, the air was cooler than I remembered. The revolving doors spun lazily behind a businesswoman rushing past with a coffee, her earpiece blinking. A man in a gray suit argued with someone over logistics in front of the valet stand, but I wasn't in their world anymore. I walked outside, letting the 4:45 p.m. breeze brush against my cheek. The sky was fading into a soft golden hue, that late afternoon glow that made even cold buildings look gentle. My shoes clicked steadily on the pavement. Behind me, I heard hurried footsteps, feminine, light, hesitant. Ms. Waverly, Tina, wait. I didn't turn around. I didn't slow down, because closure doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from choosing not to answer. I crossed the street and kept walking. She didn't follow. It was over. Everything that needed to be said had been written in the ink on that agreement, and in the silences that surrounded it. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need revenge. I'd been removed from the company I helped build without a handshake or a thank you. So I'd built something better, something clean, something future-facing, something that couldn't be taken from me because it had me built into every line of code, every client relationship, every clause. I walked for 5 more blocks before finding a quiet bench near a tree-lined plaza. I sat down slowly, letting the weight of the day settle into my bones. Not exhaustion, but release. My phone buzzed again. I almost didn't check it, but I did. A text. Unknown number. This is Alan Grayson. We met at the Canwell Advisory Roundtable last year. I've followed Nareva closely since. If you ever want to sit in the CEO chair formally, I have a board ready to back you. I read it twice, then once more. I didn't respond. Not yet. Maybe not at all, because for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't climbing, I wasn't defending, I wasn't rebuilding from rubble. I was already standing on what I had created, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for myself. As I sat there, breathing in the late afternoon calm, I thought about everything that had brought me here, the rooms where I'd been ignored, the clients who'd quietly thanked me, the interns who whispered their respect on Post-it notes when no one else dared to speak up. I thought about Rachel, now thriving inside Nareva, about Joel, who had believed in me before I had believed in myself again, and I thought about that conference room at Dane Global, where power had shifted not through shouting, but through presence. I didn't burn the system. I became the one they needed to rebuild it. And now, when they tell the story, they might leave out my name, but they'll never forget the moment I reappeared. The moment they realized the one they discarded was the one they had become dependent on. The moment the silence turned into strategy, and the strategy rewrote everything if you've made it to the end of Tina's story. Thank you for walking with her. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly erased, know this: you're not alone. And your comeback doesn't have to be loud to be legendary. Like the video. Drop a comment sharing what part of Tina's journey hit you hardest. And don't forget to subscribe, because some of the most powerful stories aren't about revenge, they're about reclamation. And I promise, there are more to come.